Hey gang, you're at Facts and Firearms. I'm Ayoob, and we're going to discuss something that once rode pretty high and now is in kind of a deep valley of lack of popularity, but may just come back, you never know. The .40 Smith & Wesson cartridge. The concept actually goes back farther than most people realize, probably mid-20th century. People like Elmer Keith, Bill Jordan, Chick Gaylord, even Charles Skeeter Skelton, who was a rising star at that time, had all said we need something in between the 38 and the 9mm and the big magnums and the big bore cartridges. Something in maybe a .40 caliber. Jeff Cooper was one of the ones who researched that quite deeply, and many considered him the godfather of the 10mm cartridge that came out in the 1980s. Now, what you had in American law enforcement and to some degree in the armed citizens community was an almost equal divide. On one side, cops who said, I want a more powerful gun than a 38 or a 9mm. I want something that begins with a 4, and to me that means 45. Chief, I want to carry a 45. And on the other side, you had a whole lot of guys saying, hey, crime is worse than it used to be. The crime patterns are more dangerous than they used to be. We need more bullets. I want one of those 16-shot 9mm. Well, when you are the person who makes the decisions for a large number of police officers, and their confidence is going to be important to their function, you've got to come up with something. And in many ways, the .40 caliber was a compromise. It began as a Wildcat cartridge, the centimeter, with Paul Liebenberg as probably the prime mover, aided by Tommy Campbell, and I believe also, at least to some degree, Whit Collins. Now, they had watched FBI's adoption of the 10mm cartridge in 1980. And from the beginning, the people who were pushing for the 10mm, John Hall, who was head of the firearms training unit at FBI, was dealing with that same thing. One faction at the Bureau wanted, higher capacity 9mm. Another faction wanted 45s. And he needed something that would satisfy the needs and the confidence requirements of all those many thousands of agents. The 10mm was seen as that compromise. The load that they came up with for it from the beginning was a .40 caliber bullet weighing 180 grains. I think the bullet they experimented with originally was the Sierra jacketed hollow cavity. They determined that 950 feet per second would be about right to get the level of penetration and expansion that they were looking for. Now, if you're a .45 advocate, well, it's .40 caliber, .40, it begins with a 4. I guess it's okay, and I will get a few more bullets out of it. And the ballistics were pretty close to the most popular .45 police load at the time, a 185 grain jacketed hollow point, running at 935 to 1,000 feet per second. On the 9mm side, the guys was able to say, well, this is like a 10-shot gun or something that they're going to give us that's way better than the 6-shooter, I guess. And it's not as many as I wanted, but I can live with that. So that was where the medium caliber was born. But consider the FBI load that colloquially the gun guys called the 10mm minus P, or the 10mm light, 180 grain bullet at 950 feet per second. That could be duplicated in a shorter cartridge. One problem with a 10mm, 10mm auto, is the same overall length as .45 ACP, meaning that you need a fairly large framed gun. A 1911 pistol, for example, or something the size of a Smith & Wesson 4506. Liebenberg had already figured out we can get those ballistics out of a shorter cartridge that we can put in a platform like a Browning high power with lots more rounds in the gun, lots more shooting before we have to reload. Ta-da! That became the .40 Smith & Wesson that was introduced in 1990. 1990, FBI was already introducing the 10 millimeter. There's recently been some confusion on the timeline. FBI had 10 millimeter way before they had 40s, almost a decade earlier. Now, the first 40 load that came out, Winchester had been working with Smith & Wesson on it, was a 180 grain subsonic going about, depending on the barrel length, 950, 980 to 1,000 feet per second. It duplicated the ballistics of the 3840 cartridge, 38 Winchester centerfire, which was actually a .40 diameter bullet, going at that velocity, but with a much more effective, modern, jacketed hollow point bullet. Now, that compromise element made the .40 almost overnight the choice of American police. There had been over here the 16-shot 9 millimeter. There had been over here the 8 or 9-shot 45. What we had here in the conventional guns of the time, the Beretta version, the Smith & Wesson 40-06, for example, were 12 shots, 11 plus 1. So you were exactly split in the middle on in-gun firepower, and reasonably split in the middle, going closer actually a little bit to the 45, on the power factor. In 1990, Glock came out, literally beat Smith & Wesson to market with the Glock 22, their Glock 17 pistol, with an extra pin in the frame to ultimately to beef it up and make it better able to handle the higher pressure cartridge. And the .40 caliber Glock was 16 rounds. So now you had the same firepower, the same cartridge capacity of the previous standard service pistols in 9 millimeter, and pretty much the power of the 45. So you can see why it was seen as the ideal compromise. Now, it never caught on with the armed citizens as much as it did with the police, simply because the armed citizens didn't need to compromise. They were buying their own guns for themselves. If they wanted a 45, they got a 45. If they wanted a 9, they got the 9. Some were conflicted on which they should get, and the 40, again, for them, was the ideal compromise round. Now, as time went on, other loadings appeared that, in my opinion, performed better. The 180 subsonic did work reasonably well as a man stopper. At the same time, there were a lot of shoot-throughs. It was a very penetrative round, and the feedback I was getting was a lot of those rounds were going through and through. Your concern there is a bullet that might endanger an innocent bystander, a brother officer who was unseen by the officer who fired due to darkness, tunnel vision, or the opponent's body simply blocked his view. The 165 grain at 1140 feet per second turned out to be an excellent compromise and a very dynamic fight stopper. It was basically the ballistics of a 158 grain hollow point, generally at that time running at about 1,200 feet per second in a typical factory load, but with a much more effective bullet, much less likely to shoot through. And the departments that had it, such as Nashville Metro, said that thing is putting them down as fast as the 125 grain 357s out of the old Magnum service revolvers. In a similar vein, there was the 155 grain load at 1,200 feet per second. And that, again, worked very dynamically. Border Patrol had it. They used, I know, Remington and I believe Federal. I know they had some Remington. That was pretty flashy in some loads, and it was hard on the guns. The recoil it wasn't like a 158 grain Magnum out of a revolver, but it was still pretty snappy and definitely sharper recoil than the 180 grain subsonic. At FBI's request, Federal and perhaps others, possibly Speer, came out with slower versions, a subsonic 165 grain going 950 feet per second, and that did not seem to have the same dynamic, immediate effect as the full power 165 or 155s, but also it was much easier on the guns and much easier on recoil. Finally, the 135 grain at 1300 that was pioneered by the Corbin Ammunition Company. The first shooting I heard of with that load was from a small police department outside Baton Rouge. And I spoke with the officer who'd been involved. He had been stepping out of his patrol car when he was attacked. The guy was coming at him with a knife. The officer could not move offline. He's caught in the V of here's the body of the car, here's the car door, and the officer's here. So he fired from the hip as he's coming up with a Sig Sauer 40 caliber pistol. He told me as the man rushed toward him and the first shot that he fired hit him, he said it looked as if the man had run into an invisible glass wall. He immediately collapsed, fell on his side, said, "Oh," and rolled over on his back and went limp. The bullet had struck him in center line of the abdomen. My first thought was a hit there had gone through the spine and cut the spinal cord. It had not. But the wound had been so massive in the soft tissue that the medical examiner's office that did the autopsy called the Corbin company to find out what explosive they had put in the bullet. When the officer attempted to give first aid to the man who had shot, he saw the pupils had already dilated. The man had basically died instantly from an abdominal hit that we would not have expected to have that reaction. Now, that load did not have the 12 inches of penetration that FBI was demanding, so it never really caught on much with police. Although when South Bend, Indiana had the 135 grain 40, they reported excellent results out of their Sig Sauer pistols in the gunfights they experienced. The California Highway Patrol today, in a time when virtually all American police are going to the 9mm, and the 40 is being seen as obsolete and, on the trash heap of history. California Highway Patrol has stuck with the 40 Smith & Wesson and the 180 grain subsonic because they feel it has worked so very well for them over a very long time, literally from 1990. They were one of the first departments to adopt the 40. So where we are now, the 40s are, because of their sharper recoil, they were harder on the guns. You had to replace the recoil springs more often and so forth. The 40 has fallen very much into disfavor. Traded-in police 40s are selling at this time for as little as $300. And when I say at this time, we're recording this in early 2026. So they're an excellent value on the market if you're looking for a good, reasonably powerful sidearm for the trail or home defense or concealed carry for that matter. The concept remains as a useful compromise for those who feel they need a compromise. And while it may be going through a period of unpopularity now, I don't think the 40 Smith & will ever go away. And I can never say that the 40 Smith & Wesson was a bad idea. But that's just one man's opinion. We want to hear your thoughts. We want to hear your opinions in the comments here at Facts and Firearms. So please share those, please subscribe, and please hit the bell, if you will, so we can notify you of upcoming content. Thanks for listening.